Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce Michael Winkelman, a colleague and professor of anthropology and a world expert, literally, on shamanism. Professor Winkelman received his PhD from the University of California at Irvine in 1985, and he's been involved in cross-cultural and interdisciplinary research on shamanism, psychedelics, and the alteration of consciousness to identify universal patterns of healing, ritual, and the underlying biological mechanisms. Professor Winkelman published these findings in several books. One of those is Shamans, Priests and Witches, 1992, which offers a cross-cultural evidence regarding shamanism, and also in Shamanism, a bio-psycho-social paradigm of consciousness and healing. Shamanism provides a biogenetic model, which Professor Winkelman will explain to us today, of shamanism, and explains the evolutionary origins of these ancient spiritual and ritual healing capacities. Professor Winkelman has also served as an expert witness for the defense in the Santo Daime case against the US federal government, which won the right of religious freedom to use ayahuasca as a sacrament in Santo Daime rituals. He retired from the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University in 2009 and lives near Piediapolis in the Central Highlands of Brazil, where he is developing a permacultural lifestyle and very actively involved and in his ongoing academic research and writings. Michael, it is a pleasure to have you here, and looking forward very much to learning about shamanism from you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for allowing me to participate in your class. And I'm so glad you're doing such an important course to help students, people everywhere understand something about the importance of, not just today, but across the long term of human development, human evolution, and all the cultural practices that still exist today that incorporate these. I've got a whole lot of things to say, obviously, 40 years of doing this, but we're going to try to give you a few highlights here in 30 minutes or so. I would just start off by saying that most of the things I've published are available at researchgate.net. You've got an academic address. You should be able to get an account there at ResearchGate for free and log in and download many of the things I'll talk about today. I'm going to start off just with the general question of what is shamanism, which is a question that many people still have. A lot of times people want to define shamanism, and Eliade started that with the notion of shamanism is defined as techniques of ecstasy. He says an essential and defining element of shamanism or ecstasy is magical flight, the ability to abandon the body and undertake cosmic journeys. Well, these are like contemporary out-of-body experiences. Lots of different practitioners can have out-of-body experiences. People have them on operating tables. So that's not really an effective definition. In other places, Eliade said that shaman was someone who enters ecstasy to interact with spirits on behalf of the community. Well, great, but this is a universal. My research says all societies have practitioners who use alter states to interact with spirits to do healing and divination for the community. So that doesn't really give us anything that distinguishes shamanism either. And I think the important point here is that, are we really trying to define shamanism? Or are we trying to discover what it is or what it was? For instance, I say, give me a definition of a whale. And you go, oh, a whale is a big fish. You go, wait, fish are different than whales. And I go, well, to me, anything that swims in the sea is a fish, okay? So whale is the big fish. That's my definition. And of course, we could point to all kinds of evidence that indicates that what we call fish and what we should call whales are different. That we would go out and discover the respective characteristics of the animals in the sea and come to the conclusion that things that we call fish don't, include within that category whales, that they're different forms of life. So this has been my approach. I don't define shamanism. I have discovered what shamanism is. And this was the basis basis of my doctoral thesis, later published as this book, Shamans, Priests, and Witches. It lays out the formal cross-cultural research methods I use to discover what is a shaman. So I examined the religious practitioners in a sample of societies engaged in formal quantitative analysis and discovered that yes, indeed, there are a group of practitioners that empirically share characteristics, and they're found in specific kinds of societies. And these are notably hunter-gatherer societies. So one of the groups that I discovered in that Shamans, Priests, and Witches book, the whole thing, which is available on ResearchGate, is that there were practitioners that were basically just found in hunter-gatherer societies only with limited amount of agriculture. Once you got to intensive agriculture, the practitioners began to change, priests emerged, etc. But these practitioners in foraging societies had a preeminent leader of the society that went by a variety of names. Sometimes anthropologists called them shamans, but often used other words, indigenous words. These people were selected for their position first based upon special signs. They were born in an unusual way. They had a sign, some mark on their body at birth, or later they begin to have dreams about their ancestors who were shamans, or to hallucinate the spirits talking to them during the day, or get very sick and have to undergo shamanic development to appease the spirits. And that development was what we call a vision quest, typically done out in the wilderness, alone for long periods of time, extended fasting, normally taking some kind of substances that might be called, special medicines or emetics. And once in a while, we get an explicit name that we know as a psychedelic. But sometimes the only thing we know is that they took, the plant that gives them the power of vision, or they took the plant that gave them light. And during this training, they undergo a death and rebirth experience, normally an experience of being attacked and torn apart by animals, dismembered, eaten, and then their bones put back together, a rememberment, a rebirth that gives them the powers of the animals within them and the power to shamanize. When they shamanized, it was an overnight ritual involving drumming and dancing and singing, and a period during which the shaman reclined and entered an altered state of consciousness, an ASC, that is this magical flight or soul flight. Notably, though, not possession. They may also experience an animal transformation. They become an animal. They experience the world as an animal and go out and do things in their animal form. So this control of the animals was the basis of their power. They particularly used animal spirits as a tool for doing lots of different things, from healing to divination to sorcery and killing other people. So in the context of their community rituals, they were normally trying to figure out the cause of somebody's illness, or where someone was lost, or where they should move, or what to do to heal someone. And their healing ideologies focused on extraction of sorcery, extraction of darts, extraction of malevolent items sent by their shamans, or they went out and recovered your soul. They say, we have several souls. Your soul can be lost or stolen or dislocated from your body. They went and found that soul and brought it back and put it back in your body. They also were involved in what we can loosely call hunting magic. They appealed to the mother of the animals to release animals for hunting. They engaged in special relationships with the animals to get them to come to where the hunters were. And they often accompanied the hunt. They led the hunt. Sorcerers were also part of what was the shaman's repertoire. They all were basically thought to have the ability to kill other people through stealing their soul, doing some sorcery, some kind of malevolent magic. And they also were thought to have special abilities to control the weather, to bring the rain, and immunity to fire. So these are the characteristics that were empirically associated with the magical religious practitioners that were grouped together with cluster analyses. And these practitioners were found in hunter-gatherer societies around the world. So to me, if you're going to define shamanism, you should define it based upon the characteristics that are associated with these practitioners, not by some arbitrary thing, which is what people typically do. I define the shaman as someone who does this or does that. I discovered what shamans are actually characterized as. Now, for instance, another group in this cluster analysis I called mediums. A lot of people say, oh, these are shamans, they're possessed, they talk to the gods, they heal. Well, they were very different. They were found in politically complex societies. They were associated with societies where there was warfare, plunder for slaves and captives. And many times the mediums were the victims of these kinds of raids. They engaged in agricultural rituals, not hunting. They protected people. They propitiated high gods. They were engaged in various forms of worship. And they were mostly females, lower social status. They engaged in group practices. Shamans practiced alone with their communities. They did exorcisms. They were not involved in any malevolence. And their altered states of consciousness were characterized by possession, being taken over by a spirit. And they manifested this in tremors and convulsions, full-on seizures, and often amnesia for whatever happened during the episode. So the mediums were controlled by spirits. So I just put this out here to emphasize the empirical groups that emerged from this analysis show very different kinds of practitioners who unfortunately today are still often called shamans, in spite of the fact that they don't bear much resemblance to the shamans of foraging societies. Other than that, they enter altered states, they communicate with the spirits, and they do rituals for healing and divination. All cultures have this, but not everybody who does that's a shaman. So why was the shaman cross-cultural? First, I'll say that the analyses I did in my dissertation showed, using what they call autocorrelation analyses, that diffusion did not explain the distribution of shamans. So it's not a question of diffusion. What does this leave us with? This leaves us with understanding shamanism as an independently invented phenomena derived from innate biological bases. So what are these biological bases? In various aspects of my work, I've tried to elaborate upon a number of these innate bases, beginning with the notion that ritual is an innate quality of primates. Primates use rituals to organize their societies and their communities, to defend themselves, to communicate, and to integrate themselves. So the ancient biogenetic functions of ritual are related to the ways in which various activities, not only ritual, but things such as grooming, elicit our opioids. They're a way in which communities bond together, because going and manipulating the body of another member of your group in a caring way elicits the opioid responses. Same thing we know about massage and therapeutic touch. It elicits opioid responses. So that is one of the bases of shamanism, an ancient ritual capacity of primates that I have elaborated on in a number of articles. Another innate aspect has to do with the altered states of consciousness. Altered states of consciousness are normal and natural. They result as a consequence of a variety of different kinds of stimuli, fasting, pain, of sleep deprivation, singing, drumming, chanting, etc. I have pointed out there's evidence that a whole wide range of different kinds of techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness produce the same basic effect. I call this the integrative mode of consciousness, or I talk about it in terms of psychointegration, which is to say that when you engage in a variety of different procedures, one of the things that happens is that the frontal brain, particularly through interference in what's called the default mode network and the prefrontal cortex, these two integrative areas of the frontal cortex lose their integrity. And what happens is that the lower brain, the animal brains, what we can call our reptilian brain, our mammalian brain, they get released. They say one of the basic functions of the brain and consciousness is to suppress information. You don't need to know a whole lot of things most of the time, just what's right in front of you. So our lower brain systems are normally sort of offline, but under altered states of consciousness, they get ascendance. Our animal brains come to take dominance. A few other things can happen during altered states. One is this out-of-body experience, OOBE. We can understand this in terms of a variety of ways in which the normal integrative functions of the brain are destabilized by the altered states of consciousness. And so some modules lose their predominance and others come to predominance. So a body-based metaphor and sense of self emerges under a variety of altered states. And similarly, ego loss occurs. Interference with the default mode network caused by psychedelics or meditation, various dissociative states, lead people to a sense of egolessness, which then allows them to feel more connected with the universe, with others, or to assume a new identity, such as an animal identity that the shamans use. Altered states and rituals both directly produce healing effects. Altered states take us into a parasympathetic dominant state, a relaxation state. It enhances the immune responses. There's a lot of different ways in which altered states initiate our endogenous healing mechanisms. And ritual does the same thing. Having a really powerful person do a performance in front of you that's designed to help protect you gives us this sense of relaxation and confidence. It makes us very susceptible to placebo effects, and it makes us susceptible to hypnotic responses about expectations that we're going to become better. The altered states and rituals have biological effects that initiate endogenous healing responses. And then the fourth point I would make here is about innate cognitive modules. Psychology has decided that there are certain kinds of mechanisms that are preordained in our brain to do certain things, and they will automatically function when given the opportunity to develop. The best understood of these is language. You don't need to teach a child language. You just expose them to language, and our brains will automatically take that information and turn the child into a competent speaker of their language. But there are a lot of other cognitive modules, such as modules for inferring agency, the presence of something, a module for understanding somebody else, what they're thinking based upon their behavior, their emotions. We have modules, for instance, for internalizing others. A child automatically incorporates the behavioral patterns of the dominant people in their environment. It's part of our innate nature. All of these can be understood as the underlying bases for spirits. They're entities we can't see, but they act like people, they think like people, and they can do things like people. And so these underlying biological innate modules provide the basis for shamanism, because the ritual alteration of consciousness gives ascendance to lower brain structures. And these lower brain structures are where our innate modules are located and function. Other innate modules include music and dance, and ultimately a variety of other aspects of our psychological inference system. And in some of my work, I have tried to explain how it is that shamanism, by integrating these innate modules, produces metaphor. And the simplest example would be totemism or animal spirits, where our self-identity module gets crossed with our innate intelligence for understanding animals, and bingo, we have animal powers, or our groups are understood as clans with certain animal identities. So Dr. Brown asked me, how old is shamanism? Well, it's a bit of a tough question, in part because we have to first ask, well, what is the origin of shamanism? Where did it come from? And subsequently, what were the stages of evolution of shamanism? And at what point do we want to call a ritual practice shamanism? Does it have to have every characteristic that I've had on the list before? Or are there sort of abbreviated versions of shamanism? If we take a deep baseline, a hominid baseline, what was it like before we became hominins, the uniquely human line? I think the chimpanzee maximal display gives us an interesting model, because chimpanzees regularly get together at nighttime. They drum on trees with their hands and feet, sometimes with sticks. They make long distance vocalization, chanting in unison, and the alpha male runs around the group engaging in dominance displays that are thought to be effective at deterring predators. So to me, this notion of nighttime ceremony, bipedal displays equal dancing, drumming, and chanting sounds like the beginning of shamanism, but I don't think we'd want to call that shamanism. What's the next big step along the way in hominin evolution? Well, I think the mimetic complex may be a point at which we say, here, shamanism emerged in its own form, distinct from chimpanzee displays. The mimetic complex is an integrated innate capacity that allows us to understand others through behavior. It's driven by what are called mirror neurons. Neurons that fire, for instance, when I raise my hand and when I see someone raise their hand. So the same neurons are fired by behavior and by perception. So by seeing your behavior, I understand what your intentions are. It provided the basis for dance, for song, for imitation, for drama, for elaborate communicative displays through behavior. So there's evidence that this complex emerged at least 1 million years ago, maybe more. and that at this point, collective ritual activity became a more significant part of human well-being. Exactly what they did in these activities, did they intentionally do dancing, or was it just, community integration and protection? We don't know, but clearly at this point we have something that's distinct from the chimpanzee maximal display, and maybe we should call this mimetic shamanism. What are the subsequent stages? Well, I'm started working on that paper. I'm not done with it. One of the important questions, of course, is where do psychedelics play a role in all this? When did psychedelics start affecting our well-being? And my simple answer is going to be at least 5 million years ago, when we got down out of the trees and started wandering around in the savannas, and we were following hunts of carnivores, and we were eventually hunting bovines. Psilocybin mushrooms grow in the feces of bovines across the temperate zones of the entire planet. There are dozens and dozens of psilocybin species that we must have been exposed to for millions of years. And I'm still working on getting a paper published that tries to make the argument that, Terence McKenna made, namely that, the stoned ape hypothesis. Somewhere along the way, psychedelics began to play a significant role in human evolution. Maybe I'll have that published before Jerry's class is over and I can share it with you. But archaeological evidence for shamanism. Well, that requires very specific kinds of artifacts. And I think that by 50,000 years ago or so, what's called the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition, we have very clear evidence in the cave art of Europe. We see depictions of humans and animals sort of combined together. This idea of the sorcerer of the Tres Freus, the three brothers who found it, combining a deer and probably a antelope, and combining a owl and other parts of this body that go together in a strange way that's partially human, partially animals. And then other depictions of flying people and people with birds on their heads. And eventually we even see rock art with mushrooms all around the heads of dancing people. Pretty clear that this has been going on for at least tens of thousands of years, if not more. So in this book, I sort of outline my biggest argument about how we evolved through the effects of shamanism and to a certain extent psychedelics. Well, what were the effects of psychedelics in human evolution? At what point did they begin to fundamentally change how it was that we perceived the world and related to others? As I said, it's an influence that probably goes back at least 5 million years. We had to pay attention to mushrooms. If we didn't, we missed an important source of food and incidental medicine. And if we did and got the wrong ones, our genes didn't get passed on. So I would contend that for millions of years, hominins had to distinguish psychedelic shrooms, you take them when you want to, nutritional ones, you take them when you can, medicinal ones, you take them when you need. Why do we do this? Well, in the case of the psilocybin mushrooms, they enhance serotonin and dopamine, the two most important neuromodulatory systems in the body. They're the most important neurotransmitter systems, and the psychedelics directly enhance their effects in a variety of complex ways. What they do in the brain is they destabilize the ego brain. The prefrontal cortex and the default mode network are taken offline. What do these two parts of the brain do? Well, an oversimplification is that they keep us in our routines. They keep us in our habits. They help us continue to think of ourselves as an autobiographical person with a certain set of history. Why would you want to get rid of those habits when the habits don't work anymore? We have to unlearn sometimes. So when there's catastrophes, dramatic climatic changes, social disintegration, all of a sudden we need to see things in a new way. And how are we going to see them? We're going back to the innate brains, the innate modules, our animal brains, this intelligence that constitutes the mass of our brain, but which we normally screen out. Don't let the emotions get in the way. Pay attention to what you got to do here and now. But sometimes you need to go back and reboot. How did humans adapt? The major theory about human adaptation is called cognitive niche theory. It says that basically humans millions of years ago began to deal with the environment through the lens of culture. We created a niche that tells us what's important and what to do about it. And how do we create these things? Well, sometimes it's just a process of trial and error. But when we enter in a crisis mode, we need a new paradigm. We need a new understanding. And of course, what many religious traditions will show that the psychedelics did exactly this for people. They gave them a new paradigm to think about the world, a new way to organize their social relations, their subsistence. So I think that the psychedelics were key in helping humans create their cognitive niche. And this is what the evolutionary anthropologists won't let me publish yet. How do they do that? Well, first of all, they enhance what's called presentational intelligence, a visual intelligence. I mean, we get visions in dreams. We also get visions on psychedelics. These are complex symbolic material that integrate a lot of different kinds of information, new understanding. So they would have given us a visual working space to think through problems. Some of the other things we know about psilocybin is that it enhances global connectivity in the brain. So the normal patterns of brain patterns controlled by the default node network and the prefrontal cortex are disabled. And all of a sudden, the whole brain's talking to its other parts of the brain. Parts of the brain that normally don't communicate with each other are communicating with each other. And all of these innate modules that are normally repressed are getting elevated and integrated. Normally, these innate modules function independently, separately. But because of the powerful integrative effects of the altered states, these things are being put together and creating new kinds of combinations, enhancing creativity, novel thought. And the psychedelics are known to enhance openness, enhance extroversion, enhance acceptance of others, stimulate social bonding. So all of these things together, visual intelligence, global connectivity, enhanced creativity, enhanced openness, and social bonding, to me, are the glue that help the cognitive niche phase of human evolution, enable humans to create new models of living in the world. So where are the shamans today? What are the contemporary shamanisms? I guess the first thing I would say, are there really any shamans left today at all? If we go back to the hunter-gatherer model. A lot of times people say, well, I'm a shaman, and I'll get, well, who have you killed lately? And they go, well, I don't kill people, I'm a shaman. I go, hey, foraging shamans killed other people. That was part of their practice. That they killed their enemies, okay? So, what is it that is a shaman? Where do we want to draw the line? For instance, when we end up in agricultural societies, we have practitioners that resemble shamans in some ways, but they no longer do community-wide ceremonies. They do ceremonies in a patient's house. They're no longer an independent practitioner. They're part of a guild, a collective. They have a professional cult that trains them. So they're no longer trained alone in the wilderness. They go to a group of people who train them, and it gives them certification. So there's these subtle differences that emerge. At what point do we say that shamans stop and it's something different? It's an issue that still needs to be addressed. I have a data set that may ultimately answer those questions if somebody wants to take on 236 variables and 117 practitioners. But we have shamanistic healers today. They're universal. All societies have practitioners that use altered states to interact with the spirits for divination and healing. But I don't think we should call them all shamans. So shamanistic healer is a broader term. Do we still have people today who use psychedelics as part of healing? Yes, it seems relatively limited, and it may be, in some sense, still undiscovered, if you can believe that. I have one example that comes from my own research, the Kung Bushmen of the Kalahari, Southwest Africa. They were considered to be, the pristine hunter-gatherer foragers, perfect example, etc. But the people who studied them really never looked into the medicinal plants that they used in their shaman training ceremonies and in their shamanic activities. And what I did was take the plants, which they fortunately recorded in their articles, and started doing research on them, and discovered almost all these were psychoactive plants, and many of them were known to stimulate the brain in ways similar to the way psychedelics do. They're probably unknown psychedelics. That article is available on ResearchGate if you want. Another thing, I've been investigating India lately on the track of Soma and the identities of Soma. And we've discovered that there's these mushroom sculptures in a lot of temples that no one's ever written about. So I gave a colleague there a bunch of pictures of psychedelic mushrooms that grew in India. And she went out into the local villages and found priests that go, oh yeah, those are the mushrooms from the Kama Sutra temples. We use these. This one's great to enhance sexual ability, and this one's good for frigid women. And we're going, whoa, I wasn't there for it. My colleague was there. But there's psychedelics out there, even in a country like India, with 1 billion people and a history of soma, and no one's ever asked the question, what plants are you still using? And I think the most widespread psychedelic traditions of the modern world have to be the ayahuasca traditions. The vegetalistas of Peru would be probably the best example of shamanic roots. But even some of the Brazilian ayahuasca churches like Santo Daime, they do things that are very shamanic. They even have one ceremony where you start dancing at like 7 or 8 in the evening, and you dance all night long, take a hour break, but dance until it's bright light the next day. How do they do it? I don't know. I tried. I'll often end up on the floor in the corner, But these people drink some more ayahuasca when they start to feel weak and get back after it. So some shamanic traditions are very much emphasizing the dance and those kinds of activities. So we have shamanistic traditions today. I wouldn't say that we have any more shamans per se. So the secrets of psychedelics are still out there to be discovered. It was discovering some of these kinds of practitioners in the 19th century that led to the understanding of what is shamanism. Jerry asked me, why are the Siberian reindeer herders considered to be the fathers of shamanism? I wasn't sure I'd heard that term, but I think the real reason is that when the Western world discovered shamanism again, it came from Siberia. It came from explorers and other, military representatives, and different people who went into Siberia and wrote down these practices that they had. And of course, in Siberia, it's not the psilocybin they use, it's Amanita muscaria, and they have a variety of different other kinds of shamanic practices as well. But this is what informed the Western world about shamanism and indirectly about some of the psychedelics. So today we use the term shaman because within the Paleo-Siberian cultures, there's lots of different words they use for the shamans that are very close to shaman. Saman, samana, sramana, etc. So this is where the word comes from. This is how the Western world learned about shamanism in its current form. One of the things that has sort of undermined our ability to understand the prehistory of shamanism is that, as has been noted, there's very strong differences in Old World, Europe, Asia, and New World, the Americas, in terms of records of using psychedelics. The Old World didn't have very many of them, although we're starting to discover more. There was lots of them in the New World, the Americas. Why? Well, I think it has to do with the level of social development. Psychedelics are associated with shamanic practices, and shamanic practices are associated with foraging societies. And modern Europe pretty much, got rid of all the foragers. You can still find some of their remnants, for instance, in the practices of the Sami and other groups of the far north, but there's just not that many cases to be discovered. On the other hand, we're all the time discovering new information about the plants that other cultures have used, sometime embedded in the accounts of priests or missionaries, or other early explorers or colonists. And only with the study of the biochemistry and pharmacology of the plants do we end up understanding that people in the past likely used psychedelics as well. So why does shamanic practice persist today? Why are we still so engaged with this? Well, first I would say, it's because anthropologists discovered this and brought it back. Anthropologists helped us recover this knowledge. But this knowledge is still relevant because it reflects biological capacities. It reflects something about our innate nature. It reflects something about our innate psychology. We have an evolved psychology that is based upon the use of psychedelics. And this one will be out in Frontiers in Pharmacology sometime by the beginning of next year. I've written a paper on the evolutionary psychology of psychedelic set and setting. The way that we optimally use psychedelics has to do with the way that we adapted to them in the context of shamanism over millions of years. So shamanism is still part of our nature, and it's something that helps meet contemporary human needs for spiritual healing, for healing through altered states of consciousness, through healing that elicits our endogenous healing mechanisms. So to wrap up here, you can go to researchgate.net. I got a bunch of my articles out there. If you got an academic address, they'll let you get an account, and you can download this stuff for free, including my Shamans, Priests, and Witches book. Some of the other stuff you can access through there, something that Dr. Brown contributed to the year before last. It was a special issue of the Journal of Psychedelic Studies on psychedelics and history and world religions. And it's all over the place. There's evidence of psychedelics in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Judaism, as Dr. Brown has shown in Christianity. And get ready for this one, even in Mormonism. Mormonism is an entheogenic inspired religion. Too bad they assassinated John Smith before he passed on his knowledge, but we've documented through lots of historical sources the entheogenic roots of Mormonism. I've suggested this one article for you, Biogenetic Structural Perspectives on Shamanism and Raves. I think it's there on ResearchGate too. And then Shamanism is a biogenetic structural paradigm for humans' evolved social psychology. We evolved in certain ways because shamanism created a specific kind of dynamic of community ritual. And that community ritual is still relevant today. And it's one of the reasons why raves are so compelling. So I'm going to plug one last book, just came out last year, Advances in Psychedelic Medicine, State-of-the-Art Therapeutic Applications, looking from a clinical perspective, what kind of evidence do we have for the use of psilocybin, LSD, things such as ketamine, and other substances as medicines. The evidence is out there. What we need is the political power to change classifications. You can't use psychedelics for medicine because they're classified as dangerous drugs that are only addictive. They're not. It's a lie. The truth is, they're some of the most important medicines from our past, and they can be for our future too. So there's my 30 minutes, Jerry, or maybe a little more.
Beautiful. And thanks for condensing so much information into this really concise presentation. Michael, I have a couple of questions for you. I have many, but I'm just going to ask a few before we let you go. I see that you were served as an anthropological expert witness in the Santo Daime case, and that allowed this to be used, allowed ayahuasca to be used in Santo Daime practices in the United States, I take it, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And I also, this is sort of an analogy to the anthropological expert witnesses who were instrumental in getting peyote legalized for the use in Native American church rituals quite some time ago. Why do you believe, and under what law or what principle did the court allow this, given that ayahuasca contains DMT, which is illegal under the Controlled Substances Act?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different levels to any successful court case. My lawyer often said, we got the right judge. This guy's going to be sympathetic to us. That was a good part of the case, I think. The other was the Religious Freedom Act, which established the right, the same act that the Native American Church used for their own use of peyote. And then in the case of the Santo Daime Church, it was necessary to show that any possible harms were not so great that they outweighed religious rights. So it was a complex case that based on a number of different expert witnesses. Most of my testimony was about how it is that Santo Daime practices were carried out in Brazil. How is it that this is a religious practice? So it was very important that we not have them disqualified as a cult, because a cult is not protected, but a religion is. So
and
basically it's a religion.
Yeah, am I correct in understanding that the use of ayahuasca in Santo Daime, which is a Christian practice, is approved or endorsed by the Brazilian Council of Bishops?
I think I've heard that. I'm not up on what's happened recently, but I understand it's got wide ecumenical acceptance and has been brought into those kinds of multi-religious bodies.
Right. Just for a moment on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and you have the word restoration there. Am I correct in understanding that in order to win this argument before the court, you had to demonstrate that there was a deep, or at least a significant historical practice and use of ayahuasca in this religion? And if so, would this preclude, I've seen a number of churches spring up where someone claims, well, I'm going to take LSD for religious freedom. Would they be able to use it because they're claiming First Amendment religious freedom under this act, or would they not meet the criteria?
Well, I mean, it would, at face evidence, seem like they might not, because normally there must be a religious tradition in which this is incorporated, and they're creating a new religion. But on the other hand, if they were to, use an ayahuasca kind of, substance sacrament, it would be very difficult to argue, well, one religion has the right to and the other one doesn't.
Sure.
But I tell you what I want to see, Jerry, is the following. I want the Unitarian Universalist to adopt ayahuasca. I think if they do that, then it just breaks down all the impediments to, the legitimate use of entheogens in religion. But ultimately, any case can be, brought up by district attorneys anywhere in the country, and the proof is in the court processes. How does the court look at the evidence and decide on the basis of it? Yeah. But I think that there's actually been some peyote churches that are not the Native American church that have won the right to practice, and part of their argument has been it's not, legal to say that one group can use something and another group can't.
Sure.
It can't just be an Indian religion. They can't outlaw it because white people want to use it, for instance.
Right. In recent years, we've literally seen ayahuasca explode out of the Amazon with ayahuasca retreat centers, ayahuasca practitioners, ayahuasca tourism, where people are going to the Amazon to experience ayahuasca, healers coming out of the Amazon and holding ceremonies in Europe and the United States. To what do you attribute this, Michael? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, obviously a lot of factors have played into this, Jerry. I mean, I think the first would be is that, anthropologists have, brought this evidence, these practices into the Western, frames of discourse. We were informed about what was going on in other parts of the world. I think secondly is that if you look at the surviving entheogenic religious traditions of the world, I mean, it's the ayahuasqueros, the vegetalistas, the daimistas, the people de Unión de Vegetal. This is the big one worldwide. I mean, sure, there's lots of little groups of people engaged in mushroom cults, but they just don't have, the cultural traditions of using this that the ayahuasqueros have. And then there are formally recognized churches, for instance, in the context of Brazil. I mean, religious freedoms sort of transcend national cultural boundaries. And so, this has been another mechanism that has enabled the daimistas, for instance, to spread in spite of the fact that it was patently illegal, because they were a religious group. They knew that they could fall back on religious freedom arguments when they were prosecuted. And
Sure.
then finally, I would say, it's an idea whose time has come. I think that the psychedelics, the entheogens, become particularly important in periods of social change and transition. And we are, I think, in one of the greatest periods of social transition in the entire history of humanity. And these are important substances for helping people adapt to change, to reorganizing the self, to reorganizing the ego, to placing the individual in the context of community. And these are sort of the religious needs that I think a lot of people have. I call them spiritual needs, I call them therapeutic needs. But all of these needs are in a very direct and positive way met by ayahuasca. So I think all these factors have contributed to its spread, including increasing court rulings, considering these practices to be legitimate and legal.
Fascinating here in that Terence McKenna, one of the pioneers of psychedelics, called for an archaic revival as part of the necessary turn that had to happen to kind of reintegrate balance into human society with the planet. Do you see this worldwide sort of explosion of an interest, certainly not universally, but very strongly in certain groups, as an example of what McKenna was calling for, of an archaic revival where we're reaching back to the past to sort of give us a compass into the future?
Well, certainly we're finding people engaged in those kinds of practices. I mean, to the extent that they're, incorporating the past as opposed to just, reinventing rituals and processes that work today. I'm not sure, but there's certainly, an aspect of this archaic revival in the practices of shamanism. I would say, the rave scene is a good example of how those ancient archaic impulses are finding an integration in modern and postmodern societies. But I think that ultimately it's probably not going to be so much an archaic revival as a sort of, a post-industrial reinvention of, entheogenic communities, entheogenic relationships, and entheogenic inspired relations to nature. I look forward to see the emergence of, true communities based around the use of entheogens. The Santo Daimistas here in Brazil have some efforts at that, moderate success. But clearly, human beings are at a tipping point in a lot of ways. We're at a multitude of crises that are inflicting the planet, even without COVID, even without global warming. And I think that the entheogens point us to a new way of thinking about ourselves, our relationships to others, our relationships to the planet, our relationships to whatever this spiritual world is that's revealed by these plants. And I think, yes, these things are moving forward. It may be that, you'll be paying $2,000 to participate in a weekend-long retreat instead of drumming out in the forest with, a dozen other people. But, the changes are coming. They're here. They're starting to blossom.
Michael, thank you very much for a really rich presentation, and I look forward to future conversations. Have a wonderful day.
Pleasure, Jerry. Good luck with your course.
Thank you.
Ciao.